Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video, which is my July wrap-up. Now, July was a busy reading month for me because I was co-hosting two readathons, the Broadway babyathon and the Tara readathon. So the majority of the books that I read, I think all but one, were read for at least one of the prompts for one of the readathons. And in total, I read 8 books, 2 nonfiction, and 6 fiction. And I would have to say that it was a decent reading month. Like, first of all, I had a ton of fun doing reading sprints, getting to know people in both readathons, but also I read a few gems. I think I have at least one 5-star to talk about, a couple 4 stars, but I definitely had a few like mediocre reads in the bunch as well. But why don't we just dive right in? The first of the books that I want to talk about is Heartburn by Nora Ephron. Now, I listened to this as an audiobook and discovered, like immediately after starting the audiobook, that it was narrated by Meryl Streep, which I was super jazzed about because I love Meryl Streep as an actress, and so this was just going to be fun, and I think she was actually in the movie Heartburn when it came out. Maybe late 80s, early 90s, don't quote me on that, but regardless, I was just really jazzed by the narrator. So this is a story of this Jewish New Yorker, Rachel, who's living in DC with her husband, and they have a toddler, and she is 7 or 8 months pregnant when she finds out that her husband has been cheating on her, and not only has he been cheating on her, but he says that he is in love. And so the book is this spiral of Rachel basically learning more about her marriage, about her husband, about his mistress, as she is kind of trying to cope with the tailspin and like telling her group therapy people and her friends and her family all of what's going on. And I don't know what I expected going into this book. I mean, I know that Nora Ephron is one of these authors that during her lifetime she was really famous. So many of her books became movies. I think she wrote screenplays. Like, she was a big deal, and I think she still is to a degree. So maybe I went into this being a little bit overhyped. I was expecting like funny haha. And I definitely didn't get that from this book. I wouldn't say it wasn't funny, but it was more of like clever humor and like smart, witty humor, which is great, but I think I was expecting like belly laughs when I was reading this book. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed it. I listened to the entire audiobook in a day, like easy peasy, but I definitely wanted more, I think, from the characters, because there are parts of Rachel as a character that are slightly annoying. Rachel also happens to be like a cookbook author, and so there would be like recipes kind of interspersed, and there was like this meta element of the book where the way she describes how she writes cookbooks seems to be the way that this book is actually written out. So there's something very meta about it, and the recipes do make sense because of the character that we're dealing with. But for me, I don't know if I necessarily would have like meshed the two things together. So maybe that was part of the problem. But I did find it really entertaining. It was written in a very conversational way. I liked the way that the book ended as well, but it really is kind of this comedy of like crazy real life things that could happen with this character Rachel and how she's coping with it when it comes to like being a mother and being pregnant and like going to therapy and trying to disclose this information, telling her relatives, all of that. So I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. I did enjoy it, but I do think that given everything that I've heard about Nora Ephron, that I was kind of expecting a little bit more than I got here, unfortunately. But I wouldn't say that I am turned off Nora Ephron as a writer at all. I would be interested in reading some of her other books or even her essay collections and kind of getting a better sense of the type of writer she is. The next book that I read was Chimes of a Lost Cathedral by Janet Finch, and this is actually the second book in the Marina M duology. Now, The Revolution of Marina M was a 5-star read for me. I read it, I think, in the first quarter of the year, and it was my favorite book for Q1. So I have a whole book bracket of me explaining why I loved that book as much as I did. So I went into Chimes of a Lost Cathedral with really, really high expectations. And while I won't say that I loved this as much as Marina M, this was still a 4-star read for me, and I really quite enjoyed it and was glad for the experience. It picks up right where Marina M leaves off. So essentially, Marina was a young girl who was living kind of in the bourgeois class, like her family was very well-to-do, and she gets swept up in the fervor of the Russian Revolution in 1917. And book 1 is all about what she's experiencing as this person who comes from this wealthy background and ends up falling in with the revolutionaries who, by and large, are from the working class and don't have the sort of education, the wealth, or anything that she grew up in. This book picks up, as I said, right after all of that has taken place, and is really focused on the civil war in Russia at this time. So between the different revolutionary sort of guards, so you have the Reds and the Whites, and it's about the civil war and this continued frenetic environment and chaos in which Marina now has to make her way, because she has basically cut herself off from her family. Admittedly, her family has also cut themselves off from her, but she now has to make her way, and she ends up having a child and moving back to St. Petersburg, and it is really a story about her finding her way. I think the best way that I could describe this is that Marina M, the first book, is about Marina losing something, losing part of herself. This book, Chimes of a Lost Cathedral, is very much about her finding it again, finding that center, that stabilizing part of her, becoming this sort of poetic voice again, and understanding her place in society. And it's really a rediscovery of a lot of the things that she kind of poo-pooed and let go because of the revolution, and now she's kind of clawing her way back to it. And it was a really, really interesting story. I don't think there's much out there that really focuses on the civil war between the Reds and the Whites in Russia during this time period, so it was really refreshing, and as someone who studied Russian history, it was a really interesting perspective to really see sort of the difficulties that the average person was dealing with during this time. I mean, the bread lines, the struggle to find work, to find housing, to just survive. So that was really interesting to me in general. A lot of what was in book 1 is still present here. She comes into contact and reconnects with people from book 1 that you haven't seen in a while. One of said characters I would like to do without, but it's definitely there. The writing is still really beautiful. I would say that this was a 4-star rather than a 5-star for me, because there were parts of it that did feel a little bit slower and maybe even redundant in her, like, living through kind of the mundane aspects of the revolution, like trying to find food, trying to find housing, all of that stuff. And it is like over 700 pages long, so I feel like some of it probably could have been tightened up to make it move a little bit faster. I do feel like in book 1 you never had that issue because things just kept happening. There were definitely lulls here, but I still really, really enjoyed it, still really appreciated the character of Marina, and also the way that sort of like history was interwoven into the story. I slow claps because it was just brilliant. So yeah, I would recommend this to anyone who likes big books or who likes a series, who's really interested in the Russian Revolution or Russian history, because it really was just a fun ride. But yeah, this was a 4-star read for me. The next book was Belcanto by Ann Patchett. Now, I went into this book really excited and expecting all the ugly tears and ugly sobs, because I watched a movie adaptation of this book with Julianne Moore and is it Ken Watanabe? Possibly. If I'm wrong, I will correct it on the screen, but regardless, I watched that at some point during the late winter, and oh my god, did I sob. Like, and when I say ugly sob, tears, snot, red face, the whole 9 yards. Like, it's not pretty at all. So I expected to go into this book and have a similar experience. And I will just say off the top, like, I did not ugly sob. I got a little misty-eyed, but I did not ugly sob. So the story is set in an unidentified country in South America, and this party is being held for this Japanese businessman there. Basically, the South American government of this country is trying to woo him. They want him to, like, invest money in their country, to, like, put a plant there and, like, help their country's economy. So they've decided to throw him a birthday party, and they actually get him to attend the birthday party because they've promised to have this world-famous opera singer perform for his birthday. So he comes, all these high-profile, wealthy people come to see Roxanne Koss sing. While she is performing, this force of guerrilla soldiers break into the house and hold everyone hostage. And this happens at the very beginning of the book. The majority of the book is what happens after these wealthy people have been taken hostage. And they are in this hostage situation for months, which I don't know if realistically that would be a thing, but in the world of this book, these people are held hostage by these guerrilla revolutionary forces, and the book is really about the relationships that form within this house over the, like, weeks and months of the hostage takeover, hostage situation, whatever you want to call it. And friendships form, romances form, and it's like a high stakes situation, but you also have these human connections, which I felt were really, really strong. I would actually say that was probably one of the, like, best aspects of the book is the human connections. You were able to feel sympathy even for the hostage takers, and even the hostages. They have sympathy and form relationships with the people that are holding them. And it's really just an interesting story about humans in general. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars because it took me a little time to get into this book. The writing style, it took a moment. I definitely had to acclimate to it. I would say that it is a little bit dense and pretty literary if anyone is interested in classifying something like that. Like, there are some sentences in here that were just stunning and breathtaking, but there isn't a ton of dialogue for the majority of the book. I feel like towards the end you get more of it, but it is just paragraphs. But it's definitely more on the literary side of things. This is not going to be like a quick read like I anticipated it being, but it was really enjoyable. I really enjoyed the characters. I really enjoyed the writing style. It was just that it was a little bit slow, a little bit dense, and this is one of those books that just don't read the epilogue. Like, don't. Just end the book at the end of the final chapter. Do not read the epilogue because you will be pissed. Because that, ooh, man, I wish I could unread it. Because it was a great story, and then I was just like, it was one of those situations. Like, the epilogue sucked. It's not a long epilogue, but regardless, don't read it. Try your best to unread it and forget it if you read this book. The next book has been keeping me up at night because I don't know how to explain it. It is strange, it is trippy, and so I'm going to do my best here, but know that this is a very, very difficult book to explain. And the book in question is Still Life with Meredith by Anne Lewinson, which I talked about in my, like, cottagecore reading vlog from when I had a weekend getaway to a cottage, obviously. But essentially, this is a novella, and it's really experimental, my friends. Like, if you are not someone who is into that sort of thing, like, don't bother with this book. Like, it is weird. It is out there. I don't even know if it necessarily has a plot, to be quite honest. It's you just kind of gotta go in and just experience it if you're going to, and see whether or not you like it. But it is really experimental. I read this basically in one sitting because it's a novella. It's under 100 pages. I think it's like 85 to 90 pages total. But the story is about this main character who is living with her friend who is an artist, Meredith, and they live in a storefront that Meredith has converted into an apartment. So the main character is in this apartment. Meredith is not. Meredith is on her way, but she's not there. And it's, as I said, weird. So the main character is basically in this apartment musing on things like her roommate's strange artwork, on the, like, house cat that she's house sitting for, on Marie Bonaparte and her, like, bizarre genital surgery that keeps cropping up. She also happens to be really into, like, psychoanalysis and Freud, Dutch, like, masterpieces, the, like, her sex life, and it's just a lot of things kind of being word vomited, I guess, out of this character who is supposedly writing a book, but her roommate Meredith has told her time and time again that it doesn't have a plot. It's weird. Despite all of that, despite that there is no real plot to speak of, I actually really enjoyed this book. It was like nothing else I have ever read, like ever, but there was something about it that just made me keep wanting to read more. Like, the weird, like, tangents that the main character goes on about psychoanalysis and Freud and Marie Bonaparte, who is related to Napoleon Bonaparte, and, like, just how everything kind of blends together and comes together in this person. Like, she's just as eccentric and quirky as you could imagine, but she's definitely the sort of person that I would love to have a drink with, because life would never, ever be dull. So this was a 5-star book for me, but it's not going to be a book for everyone, for sure. It is very experimental. Like I said, it doesn't really have a plot. But if you can get past that, if you can just enjoy, like, a really quirky character, some really interesting writing, and some really interesting observations on Marie Bonaparte and on Freud and psychoanalysis, you might have a good time with it. The good thing is that it's short. It's only like 85, 90 pages. So if you don't like it, you can DNF it, or you'll be done with it in no time. But yeah, this is one of these books that it's definitely going to be a Marmite book for people. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. I don't think that there's a middle ground here. Okay, moving right along. The next book, which was also in that same cottagecore reading vlog, was The Lamplighters by Emma Stone. I've been saying the X silently. I have no idea if that is right. But this is one of the books that was my, like, most anticipated releases of 2021. And it is the story that's inspired by a real life event. So I think sometime in the 19th century, there were these 3 lighthouse keepers that vanished without a trace in Scotland. And there were some like really weird things that were discovered. Like they vanished. The doors were, I think, locked from the inside. The clocks had all stopped at the same time. Like some weird, like potentially supernatural things going on. Let's put it that way. But this book is inspired by those events. It takes it and it kind of transplants it to Cornwall, where in 1972, these 3 light keepers vanish without a trace. The doors are locked from the inside. The clocks have stopped at the same time. The whole 9 yards. So basically the same thing, just years and years later and in Cornwall. And the story is really told from kind of like 2 time periods. So one is in 1972 and is from the POV of the 3 light keepers. And then the other part of the story is 20 years later in the 1990s, and it's about the women who these lighthouse keepers have left behind. Their lives have moved on to a degree. It kind of varies, but basically this writer has decided that he wants to figure out what has happened, and so he's in contact with the wives in order to basically spin this into a story. And it was interesting, but it definitely was not my favorite book, if that makes any sense. I ended up giving it 3 stars. There were parts of it I really liked, but parts of it that I did not. I think that the number of POVs in this book was a bit too much for something this length. You basically had the perspectives of all 3 lighthouse keepers, all 3 women, and then this like random 7th POV that comes in once and then vanishes. And I think because of that, some of the characters are more fully developed and more like well-rounded than others. Some of them just fell a little bit flat for me. But on top of that, I didn't necessarily enjoy the direction the book went in. I can't say too much because it'll spoil it, but it ended up being more of like a crime mystery type situation than I anticipated. I thought that this was going to be a book that kind of leaned hard into the potential for like supernatural things to have happened, and that just wasn't the case here. So my expectations and what was delivered just didn't align. But what I will say is that there's definitely something gothic about the parts set in 1972 in the actual lighthouse with those 3 men. There's something about the atmosphere that I really enjoyed, and overall I really enjoyed their perspectives. I wasn't as like convinced or as invested in the stories of the wives or slash girlfriends. Like, for me, they were probably the weaker characters, and that like storyline just didn't do it for me, unfortunately. So this was in the end a 3-star read for me. I think that for the most part what I've heard from other people is that this was like a very mixed review for them, or they just didn't enjoy it. So unfortunately, this is a book that's going to end up in the book graveyard, and I'll likely unhaul it at the end of this quarter. The next book that I read was Cersei by Madeline Miller, and I know I am so late to this party. Like, the party has been had, people are cleaning up, and I am just arriving. Like, I am that late to this book. But I will say that as someone who is very nervous about hyped books, who has repeatedly said that hype gives her hives, that all the hype around this book was totally worth it, because Cersei was brilliant. Like, it was, I was like going into it looking for flaws, and I could find none. I had such a great time listening to this audiobook. Let me tell you. Like, it was great. Easy 5-star. Like, there was no way I could give it anything else. For anyone who doesn't know what Cersei is about, in case you are just as late to the party as I am, it is this mythological retelling of Cersei, who is the witch that appears in the Odyssey. And so it is this retelling from her perspective, and it has a like very feminist lean to it, and it's also kind of told in the form of a memoir. And I think the first person who described it that way was actually Noelle over at Noelle 7 Pages, but it's so accurate. It's written like a memoir, even though it's fiction, and the person who is like telling the story is a goddess and a witch and magical and therefore not real. But regardless, it was just beautifully written. So for me, one of the really compelling aspects of this story was the fact that you don't need to know much about mythology to enjoy this, because the way that Madeline Miller like wove in the different myths and legends from Greek mythology was just so masterfully done. Like, you understand how kind of incestuous mythology is, because basically there are all these connections to these other stories with like the Minotaur and Prometheus and Athena and the Odyssey and Daedalus and Icarus, and just all of these different elements and how they connect to Cersei herself. But the other part of it is that Cersei and the like journey she goes on, it's great to see the way her character develops. So the book literally starts out with her like birth, however gods come to be in existence. It starts out when she's very young and she's living in her father Helios's like obsidian palace, and it is the story of how she goes from being this really sort of insecure goddess who is then like exiled to this island to becoming this really self-aware, confident, powerful witch in her own right. And it's just a lovely coming of age story in a sense, even though it is for a mythological individual. Like, there's just something really, really beautiful about it. And on top of all of that, you just have this like stunning writing to contend with. I mean, it was just so beautiful. The author knows how to string together a sentence. Let's just put it that way. Like, some of the imagery that you have, the emotions that are evoked, it was just such a good time. Like, as I said, I listened to it as an audiobook, but now I really want to own a copy because it was just fabulous, and this is a book that I know I'm going to want to reread. But I had such a good time with it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. There were points when I got a little emotional and choked up. There were points when I was just really happy. There were points when I was pissed off because Cersei was pissed off, or I was pissed off because of what she was going through. But yeah, it was just so well done. So yes, I am late to the party, but I have arrived, and an amazing book. Like, if you haven't read it already, please go ahead and read it, like, tomorrow, because you won't regret it. Like, amazing. 5 stars, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. We're down to the last 2 books, and both of them are nonfiction. The first of the books that I want to talk about is War Queens, Extraordinary Women Who Ruled the Battlefield by Jonathan W. Jordan and Emily Ann Jordan. And I hauled this book recently, so probably in the last couple of months, and I was really excited because I am always on the lookout for more historical girl crushes. And this is a book that is essentially a primer on 13 war queens who are not necessarily literal queens, but who like were involved in military campaigns and the like throughout history. And it really covers like ancient history to modern history, I think, ending with like Golda Meir and Margaret Thatcher, those types of people. And so I was just like, yes, this is a way that I can kind of dip my toe in, discover some new people, and fangirl and crush on them per usual. So I was really, really excited about the book. And I will say that it does exactly what it says on the tin. It is a book that looks into the stories, the history of 13 war queens. But for me, it was just okay. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I felt like some of it was a me thing and not a you thing in the case of the book, whereas I thought it was going to be really biographical, when in fact the book focuses more on sort of the military campaigns and the military aspects of these individuals' lives. And I know from having studied history that military history, military strategy does nothing for me. Like I find it, quite frankly, boring. I am really interested in wars, but I'm more so interested in like the human element of it and how people like dealt with the adversity and that sort of thing. I'm really more into the human interest stories. And this felt like it just leaned a little bit too much into the military side of these individuals' lives than I would have liked. And also, quite a few of them are like well-known individuals. And I wasn't poo-pooing that either. I knew that going into the book. And that was part of the draw for me, quite honestly, because like Katerina Sforza, who is one of my historical girl crushes, and I read a biography on her. She's mentioned in here. Catherine the Great, another historical girl crush of mine, who I just finished reading the like Robert K. Massey book for. Like, she was in here. Elizabeth I. Like, so there were people who I knew in here and already had read more deeply on their lives. So that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but I don't feel like I learned anything more, anything particularly earth-shattering about the individuals that I knew about. And I would say that yes, the lives of these women were really interesting, but I did feel that the writing was a little bit dry for me. Like, as I said, I've read full biographies on some of these women, and those were like page turners. I enjoyed them. This felt like it took a little bit more effort for me to actually get through than like the 500-page biography on Catherine the Great. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just how I felt. But a lot of that is a preference thing with me and not necessarily something that's wrong with the book. So really, my 2 quibbles with the book are that I don't think it was as diverse as it could have been. The majority of these women were from Europe, or at least it felt that way, and they're pretty well-known women at that. Like Cleopatra, Boadicea, Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher. I feel like they're names that most people would at least recognize if they didn't know in like any great detail. So I would have liked there to have been more individuals that I hadn't heard of and more diverse individuals, because like the chapter on, I believe it's pronounced Jinga, because I believe the N is silent at the beginning, but this warrior in Africa, that chapter had me at like the edge of my seat the entire time. It's definitely not for the faint of heart because it is really bloody and gory, but I wanted more of that. Like, that's what I wanted. And then the other thing, which admittedly is probably very nitpicky, is that there are some big time jumps here. And I'm just like, you can't tell me there aren't other women we could have, like, explored. For example, the Boadicea chapter, which is really, like, 1st century AD, I guess is how you would describe it. And then all of a sudden, you jump 1,000 years to, like, 1200. And I would have liked to have seen information on more women in that time period, and that sort of time jump, this like blackout period, it happens again after each of these like sections that the book is divided into. And so I would have liked maybe instead of a random like 13, maybe 15 or maybe 20, and made this book a little bit bigger, included women that are not kind of like household names, and more diversity, like including people from Central and South America, more people from Asia, and stuff like that. So I ended up giving this book 3 stars. Like I said, it does exactly what it says on the tin, and it tells you exactly the women who are in the book. So it's really not the fault of the book. It just wasn't the most exciting read for me. And the last book is the book that I read for my work book club, and that was How You Say It by Catherine D. Kinsler. And this is like a linguistics type of nonfiction book in which the author talks about the ways in which language, like foreign languages, dialects, just speech in general, basically help define who we are and creates this like us and them type of relationship. And we read this for the work book club. It was recommended by one of my colleagues who really enjoyed it. It is a book that I probably would never have picked up on my own, to be quite honest, but it was really interesting, and we had some really like engaging conversations about it last week when we discussed it. But it's not necessarily my cup of tea again here. Like I said, this is not a book that I would have been drawn to had it not been the book club book for work. For me, it was a little bit too science heavy. Like linguistics is very research heavy, very data heavy, as Noelle from Noelle 7 Pages has explained time and time again to me and to everyone who watches her videos. And that's not my strong suit, and I do feel like this is a book that really reads like a research paper in that it keeps citing all of these experiments and studies that the author, Catherine D. Kinsler, did, or that she refers to because of colleagues and how they intersect. But bearing that all in mind, there were some really interesting aspects of this book where they talk about like linguistic insecurity and the way that she describes it as being similar to people having like body insecurities made what she meant like so clear, and the like observation she made about how there like discrimination against how someone speaks isn't necessarily protected or like defensible in court when it should be, because it prevents people from getting jobs and getting sorts of education or being considered like reliable witnesses and that sort of thing. There was so much packed in here, and it really was interesting and a fairly short read. It was just about 200 pages, so I learned a lot. Like I really did, but it was definitely a bit of a laborious read for me. It felt a little bit dry. Also, I kept wanting there to be like some more like cultural analysis thrown in there, but again, that's because that's what I really enjoy. But like I said, this is a book that really opened my eyes to a lot about bias when it comes to the way people speak and how I may or may not react to that. So I was really appreciative of having read the book, but this was a little bit more science heavy, a little bit drier than I would have liked, so ultimately I ended up giving it 3 stars. But Noelle, if you're watching this video, I think you would really enjoy this book because there were some real gems and observations that were particularly eye-opening. But yeah, those were the 8 books that I read this month. As I mentioned, they were for my 2 readathons, and I really did have a great time. Yes, there were some mediocre books in the bunch, but the books that I loved, like I absolutely loved. I learned things, I felt things, and I feel like that is the goal when you read books. So, Let me know what books taught you things or made you feel things, because as always, I am looking to grow my ever-growing TBR. I do hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found some books to add to your own TBR. And if you did, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.